All right, time to get started. Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for Resilink's virtual panel to discuss the supply chain impact from geopolitics, trade wars, and the pandemic. My name is Melissa Geringer. I oversee corporate communications for Resilink, and I'm going to run through some housekeeping items before turning it over to our moderator, Bindia Vakil. First, thanks to everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. We created today's agenda based on these questions, and we really look forward to addressing them over the next hour. Time permitting, we may try and answer follow-up questions. So if you do have a question related to the topic we're discussing, please type it in the question tab on your toolbar, and we'll do our best to address it. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our moderator, Resilink CEO, Bindia Vakil. Bindia founded Resilink a decade ago with the goal to help transform the way global organizations approach supply chain visibility and risk. She was recently named Woman of the Year by Supply and Demand Chain Executive and has become a true thought leader when it comes to the importance of supply chain monitoring, mapping, and planning. Welcome, Bindia. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Melissa. And welcome everyone. I'm super excited to have you here. Such a relevant topic in today's environment and looking ahead at 2021. Super relevant. I think all of us in supply chain are looking around at the landscape and have the same questions. And many of our customers reach out to Resilink because obviously Resilink is in the world of supply chain risk management, and we help our customers to identify how the changing landscape, whether it's natural disaster, geopolitical, foreign affairs, etc., is one of the things that could affect supply chains in the months and years to come. Today I have an accomplished panel with me, and just in terms of what to expect, my role as moderator is actually to be taking a step back and let the experts really chime in about what is happening geopolitically or as it relates to US-China in particular. We also see potentially a new administration taking the helm. So there's just a lot changing. As we look to 2021 and beyond, we want to really talk about, the experts lay it out for us. Hey, here's what you should be seeing. Here are the things different parties will be looking at or considering. And we have supply chain experts who are going to say, how should supply chain experts take this intelligence and plan for the next year, 2 years, 3 years out? Okay, so that's the goal of this, and we really hope that this is helpful to our supply chain audience as leaders and managers making these decisions for the future. So to begin with, we have Bob Kyle, who we actually have had the pleasure of doing a couple of virtual sessions before. And so real pleasure to welcome Bob Kyle to this panel. Bob has served in multiple senior level positions in the Clinton White House, as well as in Congress. In the Clinton White House, Bob served as the special assistant to the president for international trade and finance with the National Security Council and the National Economic Council. And then he was one of the influential PhDs at the Office of Management and Budget. There he oversaw a $300 billion budget, which covered most of the international functions of the government, which included the Department of Defense, State, Treasury, and Intelligence Services. Bob is currently a partner at Hogan Lovells, where he focuses on export controls, foreign government relations, trade legislation, and policy negotiations. Welcome, Bob. Thank you for coming back and sharing your wisdom, experience, and your projections of the future with our audience. Ari Fridman, I'm super excited to have you here. Ari is a foreign affairs expert. He represents government entities, and corporations on legislative and regulatory matters before Congress and the executive branch agencies of U.S. government. He is currently a senior associate at Hogan Lovells as well, and he focuses on international trade matters, which includes advising clients on compliance with U.S. sanctions. Thank you, Ari, and welcome. I think many of us in supply chain know the next two people. Tom Linton, to begin with, is a recognized expert on operations and supply chain, with that being his core focus, procurement and global supply chain management. And he has been awarded and recognized with multiple awards, including the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Procurement Leaders Organization. He was also inducted into the Chief Procurement Officers Hall of Fame. Tom spent 20 plus years at IBM, where he was instrumental in developing and founding many worldwide trading and technical centers. And more recently, he served as the Chief Procurement and Supply Chain Officer of Flex. He's a board member to some top supply chain and consulting companies, including Reslink. Super excited to have you, Tom. Thanks for making time. And last but not the least, Tom Derry. Tom Derry is the Chief Executive CEO of the ISM, the Institute for Supply Chain Management, which is the organization that all of the supply management practitioners belong to and subscribe in and know very, very closely. Tom has more than 30 years of experience in leadership and general management roles in public and private companies, and particularly now in his not-for-profit sector. He has executed turnarounds at corporate and business unit level through acquisitions, divestitures, restructuring, and business process reengineering. And Tom has represented ISM in meetings with the White House Council of Economic Affairs, the National Security Council, the Federal System Board of Governors, and the U.S. Small Business Administration. Super excited. Thank you so much for making time today. All right, so with that, what we'll do is we'll start the topic. As many of you were gracious enough to send us your questions, we know what you want to hear. So thank you very much for doing that. In addition, there is a Q&A panel. So what our goal today is to try to get to as many of the questions that were previously submitted. But what I'll be doing throughout is just monitoring the conversation and seeing if there's a question that it makes sense to answer at that moment. So feel free to type those in, and then we'll take them up as we go. So without further ado, let's get started. I think the top and the most front and foremost question on everyone's mind right now is that how is the U.S.-China climate and environment to play out? What are the dynamics of this situation? And let's start that with Bob Kyle and go to Ari from there.
Great. Well, thank you, Bindia. Thank you for holding this. I'm always impressed with the huge size of the crowd you draw. It reminds me of what Winston Churchill said when he attended Joseph Stalin's funeral. He said, "This just shows what a crowd you can draw when you give them what they want." And so, you know, you've done a great job, and there really is something that everybody wants now, which is you've got a new administration coming in, and we all want to try to figure out what's going to happen with that. And I've always been impressed, Bindia, by your knowledge of supply chain matters. You've done a great job with this company. Let me begin by making 4 points about the U.S.-China relationship and where I see sort of the Biden administration particularly going forward. Point number 1 is that I think you will see a far more multilateral approach to dealing with China than has been the case over the last 4 years. And Biden's been very clear about this, that in dealing with China, he feels it's more effective to make alliances with our European allies and others, and to approach China as a collective unit and with alliances rather than going it alone. And so I think that's the first point that you're going to see, mainly because he sees it as a much more effective way to try to affect China in those areas where we want to have an effect on them. Secondly, I don't think you should think that means that he's going to be soft on China for 2 reasons. One, there are real substantive issues in these trade areas involving intellectual property and so forth. And I think the Biden people are very committed to dealing with those. And the second factor is simply political, that there is a growing anti-China bipartisan sentiment in Congress that's very strong, and I suspect it will only get stronger. And so he's got political tailwinds behind him as well to be stiff with China. The third point is that Biden I think in making their decision about what they're going to do about trade, will want to put this in the context of their overall China policy, which obviously has many dimensions that go beyond trade. When a new administration comes in, and I came into the Clinton White House, they will tend to get together in interagency meetings at a senior level and decide what's going to be our comprehensive China policy. And trade, quite naturally and quite appropriately, should fit into a broader context of what you're doing with China. And I think they'll do that. So I think they need some time to do that. And in addition, if he's going to try to rebuild these alliances and work with other countries to affect China, it's going to take some time to rebuild that as well. So I think that takes a little bit of time. And all of that leads to point number 4, which is that I don't, as a result, see them lifting the existing 25% tariffs that are on Chinese imports anytime soon, nor do I see them necessarily unwinding the phase 1 part of the deal where China was going to buy $200 billion worth of goods and services from the United States. I think they're going to, be intentional and deliberate and smart about this and try to figure out which way they should approach China and then go about it. So if you're trying to figure out supply chain dynamics, I don't see those tariffs lifted anytime soon, but over the medium term, I think you could probably see some changes depending on what they decide to do. So with that, let me turn this first question, though, over to Ari, who I know also has good ideas.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks everyone for joining us today. A pleasure to be with you all. In terms of sort of the near to midterm outlook, I'm in agreement with Bob. I think continuity, at least while the administration undergoes a policy review vis-a-vis China, we should be looking for continuity. Having studied at Bob's knee for so long now, I will steal one of his turns of phrase. I think one thing we have to that you can predictably foresee that there may be what Bob refers to as an exogenous event. We can't guarantee that the administration's policy review will happen in a vacuum, right? It certainly won't, right? There could be external events that shake up the status quo and sort of force the administration's hand with respect to China. And of course, it's hard to predict exactly what kind of incident that might be, but I think every U.S. administration, who sort of wants to be deliberative, more often than not, there are external events that do tend to intervene. The only other quick points I would make are with respect to the 301 tariffs, which all of you are probably familiar with. This administration, the outgoing administration, the Trump administration, did implement a process for exclusions to the tariffs, and so we could see that revisited and perhaps expanded. So with that, one more quick point, and maybe we can talk about this later on. Is they say that personnel is policy, and yesterday came word that President-elect Biden is going to nominate a lawyer who works for the House of Representatives, and specifically in the Committee on Ways and Means, the chief trade lawyer, a very talented woman named Catherine Tai, who's very well respected on both sides of the aisle, and is really really a trade expert. She is viewed as having pretty hawkish views on China, and so that will certainly play a role in the administration's policy. Back to you, Bindia.
So I think Tom, maybe we can start with Tom Linton and have Tom Derry just quickly chime in, as in, how do you see, supply chain managers reacting? I think it was valuable to hear that we may not see the tariff going away necessarily, but the exclusions might get expanded, etc. Can you talk a little bit about how we as supply chain experts can start preparing for some of the actions needed to take advantage of the change in policy?
Yeah, I would say that what's really been happening since the Great Recession about 2008, 2009 is what the economist termed last year as a slow unraveling of what has been before. And I think that's more a statement of the word I use is more of a post-global shift where, and not because of politics, really not because of tariffs, but the fact that costs have been rising in places like China for a long time. And as costs have been rising, the surge or the rush to globalize in that direction, which drove capitalism and drove U.S. companies, and I was part of that in the 80s and 90s into the 2000s, where you had tremendous cost differential in direct labor, drove so much of that business into China. A lot of that is tapering off for reasons just purely, simply business cost and the landed cost difference. Plus, supply chains tend to get extended when they're stretched way over into China. So you've got a lot of cash tied up in boats and planes. And the more valuable that material, the more the carrying cost and the greater the cost that becomes. So I think there's been this shift, this slight unraveling. And for that reason, I think, multilateral will always be a good idea, I think, from a supply chain manager standpoint. But a lot of people are taking a hard look now at places like Mexico. And primarily because some of the direct labor costs there are not that far off what it used to be in China. So when you're moving big, heavy, or expensive things, proximity in supply chain has a great amount of value for two reasons. One, because proximity facilitates speed and customer fulfillment, the whole Amazon effect. But it also facilitates improvements in the balance sheet and the cash side of a company. So I think we're going to see industrials really start to look, and they have been over the last 10 years, investing more in places like Mexico.
I agree, Tom. And northern Mexico, which is very close to where ISM is headquartered in Arizona, has become really an advanced manufacturing destination, particularly in automotive and aerospace and defense. And when the Trump administration considered imposing tariffs on car parts coming out of Mexico into the United States, they quickly were unaware that some of those parts move across that border 4 or 5 times before final assembly in the United States. They'd be subject to tariffs each way, right? So that was a mistake that they did make, I guess, in the end. Now, I agree that regionalization of supply chains is a strategy that more and more supply managers are going to consider. It's China plus one in many cases. The COVID-19 pandemic clearly exposed some of the disruption risk that exists in one-way globally extended supply chains, and for lots of policy reasons, including maintaining a medical industrial base in the United States, for instance, to lessen our strategic vulnerability in that critical area. We could see policy incentives that would incent companies to either find domestic sources of supply for critical pharmaceutical or medical device equipment, PPE. And there's a lot of discussion in Congress around that, I believe, although I'm not the expert. Bob and Ari are the expert on that element of it. So I think there are lots of reasons why companies are considering proximity to the end customer, customization in the last mile of delivery, which is an important factor. Another reason why companies are considering it. And if I've got 3 or 4 global supply chains as opposed to one single globally extended supply chain, I may have a disruption for South America, but 80% of my operations are running normally. Fine. If I am relying on a single supply chain, one disruption could put me out of business. So I think there are lots of reasons why supply managers will be considering these alternatives. Qualifying more suppliers is another thing that we've seen. Generally speaking, the dynamic of the last years has been to leverage your spend volume and direct as much spend as you can to a single supplier to get the lowest cost, per unit. But we've seen the pandemic begin to cause that thinking to be questioned. And I sacrificed a couple of points in cost by having another supplier that I can ramp up quickly in the event of a disruption, and therefore not lose my opportunity to be in the market, right? And cede market share to my competitors. So there's definitely a willingness to consider the risk elements as a trade-off to the cost elements, and possibly trade off some risk protection against overall absolute cost. So there's a lot of changes that are causing supply strategies to be reevaluated.
There's a quick question, so 1 or 2 points before I go to one of the questions on the screen, but I think it was really interesting about Mexico and regionalization, which is certainly something we've talked a lot about. China plus one recently as well. One question is around this whole notion of, we might have a regionalized supply chain. We'll look at other regions around the world. But I think as we were doing our conversation last week, we talked about the fact that companies don't just manufacture in China as a source of materials anymore. In fact, we sell to China, and I think Tom Derry, you had some statistics on GM sells more cars in China than they do in the US. So can you talk a little bit about the US-China relationship, also in the context of China as a destination for revenue versus just a source?
Yeah, it's a critical market. I mean, in 2019, just to finish, General Motors delivered just over 3 million vehicles in China and about 2.8 million in the United States. So it is the largest auto market in the world and the most important market for General Motors. It's a critical market for Boeing, right? Boeing is the largest exporter in the United States. So there's clearly their emphasis in terms of electric vehicles, for instance, has made Tesla a very important company, which now has operations in a free trade zone outside of Shanghai. So we can't ignore the fact that China is going to be a very important commercial market for U.S. companies, and we're going to have to maintain supply networks in order to serve customers in that part of the world. But maybe less emphasis on sourcing in China and sourcing for delivery to the United States or other markets outside of China.
Yeah, and also I think we have some comments about there's a little bit of a sound issue, so I think it would be great if the panel can be muted while someone else is talking, and then we can do off mute. Sorry. Everyone's, I think, Wi-Fi is a little challenged these days. So I think, thanks, Tom. One other, I think, I know we have a few questions about Brexit. I mean, I just feel like the world around us is, it's in the state of flux. We've enjoyed about a couple of decades of relative stability. If we just look at the tariff situation, I think we tend to focus a lot on the US-China dynamic, but tariff is a global phenomenon, right? We kind of open Pandora's box almost, and suddenly Resolink, certainly in the first 2 years after we announced China tariff, there were about 50 alerts in 2 years about different countries imposing tariff as a strategy on different things. So I think for Bob and Ari, any thoughts on tariff, Bob? I think you had some interesting insight on that.
Oh, hello there. There you go. I'm unmuted now. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that when NAFTA was first negotiated, one of the arguments that was made for it was that you needed regional production centers. There was fear. I know Salinas was motivated by the fact that he thought at that time Eastern Europe looked very threatening, and that the low-wage countries of Eastern Europe would align with European countries and be a force, and that Japan would align with China and be a force. And the feeling at the time was that you needed some regional power coming out of North America. And that was one of the arguments that was made for NAFTA at the time it was made. I think that's what you're referring to, Bindia.
Ari, you'll have to unmute. Sorry, this will make this interesting. Go ahead, Ari.
Sorry about that. Yeah, the only thing I would add is to your point, Bindia, we are seeing a proliferation of reciprocal tariff actions in between, even in between democratic rivals. To take, perhaps the most obvious example, Japan and South Korea. There's certainly a healthy competition, rivalry, if you will, between those two those two countries. And as some of you, I'm sure, know that they had something of a national security dispute that emerged out of a World War II era issue, the so-called comfort women issue. And so you really had both countries. The Japanese perspective is that the comfort women issue should have been closed decades ago by virtue of a bilateral treaty that had been agreed to, and over the course of time, the Korean position was that the Japanese government needed to formally apologize for the comfort women issue. The Japanese government, in their view, did apologize. In any event, within the last few years or so, the Korean government sort of reopened the comfort women file, and Korean courts allowed, at least in theory, the ability for Korean plaintiffs to pursue damages against Japanese interests for their wartime activities. And so anyhow, this dispute kind of spilled over and ultimately led to sort of a reciprocal export control restrictions that each country placed on the other. And so you kind of have here a mixing of, a geopolitical issue with trade actions, and of course it's sort of hard to separate the two. They're also linked. So and of course the from a U.S. government perspective, there was an attempt to mediate these issues somewhat unsuccessfully. And so I think maybe going back to Bindia, your prompt here, I certainly do not think we're at the end of history. History has not stopped. It's moving on, and I think that theory we can say was premature.
Yeah, no, I understand, and I think that's the thing, right? Ultimately, it all affects trade, and Bob and Tom, we've had a conversation, and Ari with you as well. Is the world of supply chain risk keeps giving. 3 years ago, we were debating whether there would be a war between the U.S. and North Korea, and would supply chains in South Korea and Japan be impacted, and how? And then we lived through 2 years of tariff. We, of course, went through Brexit, and a lot of protectionist type of measures have been put in place in between. So let's go to one question about Brexit. I think that also is on people's mind. I think obviously that is another evolving situation in the geopolitical landscape. There's talk of bilateral agreements and all of that. Can you talk about, I'll maybe start with the supply chain side right now, and then maybe we can go to the geopolitical and foreign affairs experts to talk about how can we start thinking about this, planning for it, etc. Tom Linton?
Yeah, I would chime in by saying that trade is about flow, and when you have problems in supply or supply chain, it's about friction. So trade agreements facilitate flow for the most part, and tariffs would facilitate friction. So if you're in the business of doing cross-border operations, you really want to have a smooth flow as possible, and that all ties into good financial outcomes, whether it be lower cost or balance sheet or revenue. So I think most business people would agree that's really the paramount importance, next to what I said earlier about proximity, distance. So if you can have things move freely in. The problem right now, and most industries have this issue, supply chains are highly complex. It's not uncommon that you're buying a part in China for assembly in the United States and then shipping it back to China to be sold, or versa versa. You've got a lot of movement of materials from raw material all the way up through many layers. So this complexity, WrestleLink has a really important role to play, because it's with the complexity that you have problems. because you can't see it, therefore you have a problem because you have some underlying issue that causes a disruption. And that disruption could come from anything, not just one thing, given what we just talked about in terms of complexity. So something like a Brexit really would be something probably more aligned with creating friction than flow, where the, if you think about the EU and the free movement of people and resources and things, probably better. So I'd always come down on the side of, facilitate flow, or does it create friction? And that would be kind of where most business people would think when they look at it country by country.
Yeah, Brexit to me has to be understood as sort of the consequence of a pattern in the background. So if you think about 89, the Berlin Wall falls, right? 91, the Soviet Union breaks up. 95, China exceeds the WTO. 99, the euro is introduced, right? All these non-governmental actions, really. 97, Hong Kong gets reunited with China under the, one country, two systems plan. So a lot of barriers to, the movement of global commerce had been eradicated. It was sort of an absence of geopolitics, and really is a sort of an aberrant period in world history. And what I think you're seeing now is, the Brexit vote could be explained by, from the point of view of British citizens as we're fed up with ceding our sovereignty to, extra UK institutions like the European Union. We want to say in how, we manage our borders and all of that. And I think what you're seeing play out in the UK and other countries around the world is a willingness by politicians and state governments to say, you know what, actually sovereignty matters. Our people aren't happy with, relationships with unelected bureaucrats in other parts of the world having say over their lives. And I think we're going back to an environment where, unfortunately, I suppose if you're in business, geopolitics is going to be a factor in how you manage your business. And you'll have to be thinking about it in a way we haven't had to think about it for about 20 years. And I think if you want to think about China specifically, China is normally very transparent about its policy aims. It's public about its goals. It's very out there and straightforward, but it's also relentless. It will not give up. It doesn't believe it needs to compromise, right? It clearly sees, I think there's an era of great power competition between the United States and China that's emerging. And I think that will be a dominant factor in setting the sort of commercial environment for companies in the next decade.
Bob? Bob, you're on mute.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. If the organizer could leave me unmuted, I'd appreciate it. I'll mute myself when I'm not speaking. I really appreciate it. Okay.
Unmuted.
Remind me, since I was dealing with that, remind me what the question is.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I was so focused on the unmuting.
Yeah, we're talking about Brexit, Bob, and the fact that, I think Tom had a really interesting point. Looking back at history, we've kind of enjoyed a couple of decades of relative calm and peace, and but also some, more countries feel like they've given up power to make basic decisions, which sort of culminated in Brexit. And actually even TPP and all of those things, I think we were all sort of getting a little more multilateral, and now there's a shift against that. So talk a little bit about how you see the new change looking ahead at the next 6 months or so, or 2 years.
Yeah, there is a large debate in the international community about whether what we're going through is sort of a speed bump, we'll say, on the way to greater multilateralism that occurred in part because of the 2008 financial crisis and the economic fallout from that and so forth, which typically leads to a retrenchment in trade and can lead to that, versus whether we're at an inflection point and our commitment to multilateralism and so forth has just changed. And you see elements of that, Brexit and a lot of the Trump administration policies being a really good example of some of that. And I think that's still not entirely clear, but I do think there's no question that with regard to trade policy in most of these countries, it has taken a hit, and governments need to demonstrate to their citizens that a more open multilateral trade system does benefit them and helps them. And I think one of the things that Biden does, we're going to talk about this later in this meeting here, is that his main focus as he comes into being president is really to focus on domestic issues and rebuilding American competitiveness and rebuilding the American economy. And he sees that as sort of a first priority before negotiating a lot of new trade agreements. So I think, and part of the reason for doing that is to rebuild a political consensus around an open trading policy, a more open trading policy. And so, and make sure that trade is working for everybody. And so I think you do see that, and I do think it's under attack throughout the world. You're seeing a great deal of that as it goes on.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that, and this is if you look back at history, you know, the world has only gone more and more globalized. I don't think that there have been periods of time when we as a world kind of take a step back, reevaluate, but the cat is out of the bag. We are more connected using social media, good or bad. I'm not commenting on the good or bad of social media or debating that here, but the reality is we are connected as a race, and it's hard to put that back in. So I don't see that this protectionism is a lasting trend. I think it's a correction in the market, if you will, in the trade markets. But I don't see that that is a stoppable trend. I think that actually brings us to another very related topic. Actually, someone has asked this question, is there's a dependency on China. We talk about more countries are trying to be more regionalized. Obviously, this all has a cost, you know. And when it comes to risk and resilience, we talked about Mexico, and you know, Mexico isn't as inexpensive as China either. And then we talked about China and Asian countries in general. That part of the world is a net consumer of the products that are made. So it's such an interconnected world. We're not just sourcing from Asia, we're selling into Asia. So is really, you know, and there's no real region in the world that is truly risk-free. Even in the US, we have hurricanes, we have factory fires, we have these risks no matter where we go. So Tom, help us understand, you know, how are we going to absorb the cost or the economics tied to a regional or a China plus one supply chain, given that we are part of an ecosystem that is very interconnected?
Well, I think anybody who woke up in February and heard Apple's guidance and said that they had a problem in Wuhan, China, and saw their market cap fall several $100 million in a day, it was kind of like the canary in the coal mine. And I think, you know, we're going to have always, as a chief supply chain officer, I always called it crisis du jour. When I woke up in the morning and running a large complex supply chain, you never knew exactly what the problem was going to be, but you're going to have a problem just because there are so many layers in supply chains. So I think this concept of multi-tiered visibility is table stakes for managers today. It's table stakes. If you don't have multi-tier visibility, you're just running blind. You're actually driving your car at night at a high speed and you have no dashboard and no headlights, and you can't see where you're going. So I think this concept of visibility in supply chains is table stakes for anybody doing business globally. But having said that, I think when you look at China, you know, labor costs have been climbing in China, and in some cases, direct labor in Mexico, as I said, is actually lower in Mexico than it is in China. But China is a tremendously productive economy, and the companies there are tremendously successful and productive. But what's more likely is you're going to see, I call it, you know, It could be U.S. companies ring fencing a Chinese company, or Chinese companies ring fencing a U.S. company in the United States, where the multilateral trade is going to become more co-economic development. There was a book written 20 years ago, which I always found fascinating, called Non-Zero by an author named Robert Wright. And he often talked to about how over time, every generation of man, right, has gotten more and more collaborative than the one before. Now you have wars and all these issues, but if you go back to the 1500s and the 1400s and places, I mean, it was a constant state of war between tribes. So it may look bad, but it's much better than it used to be. So I think this concept of actually just business managers accepting complexity as the rule, understanding what they need to do to manage complexity, and to use the tools that are available to help accelerate that business. I think this is going to be the norm. I do not believe there will be major conflicts. I don't believe that those things will be on the near horizon. There may be incidents and accidents that cause problems, but I think there's a general will, as I do business and have done business in Asia and China for decades, for a much more co-prosperity, I guess would be the right word for it.
And I would add that I think that there are both subsidies and incentives are increasingly going to become important. We talked about tariffs already, but I think that, under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, corporate taxes were reduced in the United States. The United States is now more tax competitive compared to other jurisdictions around the world. That's really important that it stays that way if we want to incentivize companies to create domestic operations to manufacturing and to move businesses back here. I'm not a big believer that in reshoring. I don't think that's going to happen. I think some nearshoring will happen. But if we don't take a look at that, or if we reverse that tax policy with regard to companies, it's going to be hard to overcome that. And other jurisdictions will become favored in terms of where businesses will locate. Taxes are a huge driver of supply chains. Don't be surprised if other companies continue to be very aggressive on the tax. Other countries continue to be aggressive on taxes, notwithstanding some of the countervailing pressure at the EU level, for instance.
Tom, this was a key point that you brought up last week too, and I think, Robert, this is an awesome point to ask you about, because when it comes to taxes and subsidies, right, it's countries like China, countries like India, they mandate that if you want to operate or sell in that country, you have to have a certain percent ownership. There's so much regulations, rules, and subsidies that are really against free trade. And we've tried for many years to make them follow these rules, but they haven't. So this is the root cause as well, besides the IP protection. We'll get to that in a second. But the issue of subsidies makes it cheaper, better, easier to locate internationally, while in the US, we don't offer this to our companies. So can you talk about that as a policy issue, what we can expect there?
Sure. I mean, if you look at what Biden is proposing, a lot of what he's proposing in terms of, he focuses first of all on trying to rebuild America and reinvest in America and bring back American competitiveness. So he's for affirmative government policies to do that. For example, he wants to invest $400 billion in clean energy and infrastructure procurement to try to facilitate and advance those industries. He wants $300 billion invested in breakthrough technologies. And so I think he wants to do some of it. I think that is layered on top, of course, of an American approach that is far more free market than China. And so you have a basic fundamental, philosophical difference that we believe generally that the best way to advance things is the free market, and that in the long run will be more effective than government control. But China has a different view on that. And that debate goes on. I do recall in the 1980s, everybody thought that Japan was going to completely dominate America in coming decades because it had a more government controlled economy, and that didn't turn out to be right. So let's see what happens here. But Biden, I think, would make some investments in the United States to try to improve that. But I don't know that we're ever going to have the same kind of system, probably, thankfully, that China has, in that we don't believe in that kind of control.
Ari, any points to add on that?
Yeah, briefly, an interesting development in the last few hours or so is it does appear that President-elect Biden has selected somewhat of an unconventional or unlikely choice to run an entity within the White House that some of you may be familiar with. It's more of a kind of an inter-Washington thing, but the Domestic Policy Council, which is kind of like the internal think tank within the White House, if you will, for domestic policy issues. Anyhow, President-elect Biden is apparently going to put Susan Rice in that position. Susan Rice, of course, was among other things President Obama's national security advisor in his second term. She has a national security background. She's also been the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. One thing I can tell you about Susan Rice, I don't know her, but I know people who do, and I've read her excellent memoir. She's a very strong personality, and she had been, frankly, in strong contention for Secretary of State, and so I'm not sure that this job was necessarily her first choice, but the fact that President-elect Biden is putting Susan Rice in that position, I think, speaks to the emphasis that he is placing on his domestic agenda. And I don't think Susan Rice would have taken that job unless she felt like she was really going to be empowered to run point. Now, as a practical matter, Susan Rice does not necessarily have the best relationship with Congress for a variety of reasons. And so it will be very interesting to see and all of the issues that we're talking about here and that Bob mentioned, all of those issues, Buy America and, doing big infrastructure, all of that is going to take very, very complex negotiations with Congress on both sides of the aisle. And so you're going to need somebody with a lot of finesse to pull that off. So it'll be very interesting to watch how Susan Rice handles that job, because I suspect that she will have a large role in the execution of Biden's domestic agenda.
Yeah, so interesting. So on the theme of the domestic agenda, I think, and Tom, you guys know this, at the root cause of many of these, we want to invest more in the U.S., but when we did invest more in the U.S., we had a 3.6% unemployment rate, right? So we want to hire people. You can set up a factory, you can build it, but you can't staff it. We have these macro trends around, we don't want to let immigrants in. These immigrants sometimes are the employees who will run and operate a factory. So there are all these kind of policy measures that seem to be almost in contradiction with the need to have a thriving working economy, the ability to have labor to operate these factories, the expertise, and we don't just overnight build skilled labor to run a power away for fab. So it goes back to what Bob talked about with education and creating the competitiveness and the ability to deliver on this vision. These things don't happen overnight, right? So as it relates to supply chain experts, who are thinking about, well, I'm looking to approve a project for my next factory, where do I set it up? What are these trends telling me the most likely situation is? What are you considering? What are you hearing? And then we'll go to Bob again to talk about just policy-wise, what do you think we can expect?
One of the things it's kind of a tragedy in a way. Look at what China's done with its Belt and Road Initiative since 2013 to build infrastructure, right? The U.S. has nothing really comparable to that. In fact, shame on us that we don't have a national strategy around this. And if I look at our destiny, right, as a geography, right, it's Pan-American. We need to do something different. We need to do something different with Mexico. I know a company building a factory in Costa Rica right now, which is a great place to do business. Difficult to get there. Shame on us. Why don't we have infrastructure that ties and knits together North America and South America? You can't drive from Canada down to the tip of Argentina. There's no way to do it. Why is that? Why can't we do something different, do something better? We built a railway across the United States. but we have yet to knit ourselves together north to south. So I think there's a bigger issue here. I think how we deal when think about Mexico, I think how we think about our economy, we need to get bigger. China is getting very big. Russia is already big, both from a land mass standpoint and an influence standpoint. I think we have to stop thinking it's so small. That would be my take, and I said as much when I spoke to a National Contract Management Association meeting last week. I think we got to rethink it.
Let me talk about that a little bit there. One of the things right now, as you know, Congress is considering a new COVID package at roughly about $900 billion that they're hoping to pass before Biden's inaugurated. If that happens, the indications are that Biden would like to do new legislation that would both focus on COVID, but would also be an infrastructure package, maybe some other things that helps create jobs and helps both deal with COVID and deal with the economy. One of the challenges he's going to have is that some of the Republican senators are already saying, having spent $2 trillion on a COVID package earlier this year, and now if we do another $900 billion package, there's going to be resistance to spending a lot of money. And that is something that's a reality that Biden will face in terms of trying to get enough votes for legislation he wants to pass. And so, what's great about this is that just about everybody on the Republican and Democratic side is in favor of infrastructure. Where these efforts always run into trouble is getting the money to pay for it. The concept is great, but can you get the money to pay for it? And that will be a substantial issue as they try to move forward with greater infrastructure efforts.
Yeah, speaking of Belt and Road, yeah, go ahead, Tom, and then I have.
Yeah, just a factor that has to be borne in mind. Many Americans didn't realize that 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients in our medicines come from China, right? The raw material actually comes from India, goes to China, it gets processed there, and then comes to the United States in the form of medicines. And one of the reasons for that is we don't like some of the dirty jobs. We don't like having refineries in the United States. We don't like having chemical processing plants in the United States or in Europe. We don't like digging mines. The reason China has 80% of the world's supply of rare earth minerals is not because it's only found there, because we don't want to dig mines in the United States or other countries to produce these materials. So we have to, as a supply chain person, I have to think about the policy environment that's discouraging it's my ability to pursue business for other reasons, which are perfectly good. The standard of living is quite nice in the United States. You've been to China recently, it's hard to draw a clean breath. So there are reasons why we have these policies in place, but they come with costs and economic consequences, and we have to bear that in mind. If we talk about infrastructure, and I fully support the infrastructure in China is far superior to it in the United States right now. I fully support a policy in that direction. The NIMBYism that's going to come up when people talk about building new highways and new airports is a real factor we're going to have to do. You don't have that kind of dissent in China to deal with. They want to build a new city, they do it overnight, right? And they're done with it. So it's hard for us to, in some ways, we get our own way when we're creating policy around, and we're going to have to understand that maybe if those goals, those economic and business goals are that important to us, we're going to have to clear a path a little bit in order to be able to reach them.
Yeah, so this is an interesting, I think what Tom brought out are some very important points. I think I love the, think bold, because ultimately what has China done with the Belt and Road Initiative is that they've built the infrastructure in Africa. And I think, Tom, what you mentioned was a lot of the medical pharma source material comes from Africa. Well, a lot of the source material we rely on for other industries does come from Africa and India and these countries, right? That China is basically, these governments are indebted to China. Whereas here we are doing these charity projects in Africa. They've empowered Africa by building their infrastructure. And in return, the Africans are now almost pseudo-owned, because they're indebted in such a big way that they control, the Chinese now control a lot of the port and other infrastructure. So the way we look at it is China is playing a long game. We don't have our act together. Tom Linton's point about think big, here you have proximity to South America. We haven't taken that approach. Why not? And how can the administration work collaboratively to make some of these things happen? Because these are resource-rich countries. We should have partnerships closer to home. I have one final point. I think this was fascinating conversation for me. So a couple of things just to summarize at the end. You know, we have 4 more minutes left. Just as it relates to what we are looking forward. I think one of the things you mentioned is in the next 3 to 6 months, we'll be very focused on COVID, reviving the economy, but just in general, talk a little bit about the next 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, 2 years, right? What do you think we will see? You know, 6 months, maybe nothing changes a lot, but what will be sort of some of the things that we can, as a game theory situation, you know, just give us most likely we will focus on these 3 things, and then we can plan for those.
That's a really excellent question, Bindia, and a hard one to answer. I always start these things with understanding what we will know. It's quite likely that Biden will have a very close majority by either the Republicans or the Democrats in the Senate. In other words, we know it's going to be close. We don't know because of these Georgia races whether the Democrats will control or whether the Republicans will control, but we know it's going to be close. And what that does is it puts a real premium on probably having to work with the other side of the aisle to get things done. Now, I think high priorities for Biden probably would have been things like climate change. I think infrastructure. And infrastructure is an area where there is bipartisan agreement. As I said, it does run into the challenge of the funding of the thing because a lot of money's been spent on COVID and some of the Republicans are becoming more and more resistant to spending more money. But I would think infrastructure is high on the list of things that will be attempted. I think climate change is another big one. And then you deal with issues, and I would underscore Ari's point. Don't ignore exogenous events. I mean, did Trump think that he would be dealing with a global pandemic 2 years ago? Stuff can happen that changes what you're focused on. So that's out there as well. But those are some of the top areas that I would think they would be focused on. But whether they can get bipartisan traction on some of those things is a little less clear.
I think just in closing, I want to just summarize, you know, I think we talked about near term. I think we'll not see a whole lot of change on the tariff front. There might be some exclusion list revisitation, as Ari pointed out. So I think just tactical blocking and tackling, I think we need to kind of be prepared for that. To summarize on the China Plus One or the regionalization, I think what Tom talked about is, hey, look, you know, there's a cost. We see that there's a post-global supply chain, although this may very well be a correction because some of these things take decades, if not, you know, are maybe impossible to economically change given the fact that the supply chain and the globe is so interconnected. So I think the decision has to come down to, as Tom Linton said, you know, the landed cost, the proximity to your customers, proximity to your suppliers, and the inner intricacies of, you know, how to economically run the supply chain. And I think the key point in closing is, you know, we had Yossi Sheffi, who is our a professor at MIT, a couple of years ago when he launched his second book. And in a speech he mentioned, you know, he said, what is the worst supply chain disruption you can think of? And I started scratching my head because I've been 20 years in supply chain about the Japan tsunami and this and that. And he said the worst supply chain disruption actually hasn't happened yet because the past is bound and the future is unbound. So the worst supply chain disruption is actually coming. So the best thing you can do is to use every disruption to prepare for that one, right? And the way you do that is to build information, bring visibility, multi-tier, 24/7 monitoring, harness the tools and technologies available to us today to manage and prepare for that disruption. As Bob said, you know, Trump couldn't have predicted. No one could have predicted the pandemic. But we did see that people who had data, who had multi-tier visibility and monitoring and capabilities, and had good, solid collaborative partnerships with their suppliers, fared better in this black swan of black swan events. So I think in closing, just to say, that changing supply chains, billions of dollars, holding more inventory, hundreds of millions of dollars, investing in visibility, and that's my plug for Resolink, investing in supply chain visibility, piece of cake, a couple of 100,000, you're there. It's a no-brainer to prepare for this post-global world. So thank you all for your participation, for your questions. The book Tom Linton recommended, Tom, last words, was Non-Zero by?
That's
Tom?
right.
Non-Zero by?
Non-Zero by Robert Wright. Yeah, it's about, what, 20 years ago or so.
Thank you. Someone on the panel asked that question. Thank you so much, everyone. Best of luck. Wish you all Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and hopefully a much better 2021 than 2020.
Thank you very much.
Bye, all.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you, Bindia, and our panel, and to our audience for attending today. We're going to be sending out a recording of this soon, and we also hope to have a recap published on our blog in the next week, so be on the lookout for that. And in the meantime, take care, everyone. Happy holidays and stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.